Everybody to our weekly webinar. I'm Jimmy Rich. I've been an MVP for 2 years now. I work for Qdabra and living in Japan, but working out of New Jersey today. Today we're going to be talking about ways to protect your data from people seeing stuff that you don't want them to see. Just as a bit of a disclaimer, today we will be showing techniques that use Qdabra products such as qRules and DVXL. So here's today's agenda. Just to let you know, if you're going to need audio to hear this presentation, if you don't have audio, I imagine you can't hear me right now, but this presentation is available on YouTube afterwards. We're going to talk about techniques for about 10 minutes. I'll intermingle that with some demos, and we'll follow that up with a Q&A session where you can ask us anything about today's webinar, about InfoPath in general, or about Qdabra products. Okay, so I think I don't really need to tell you why you would want to protect your data, but as an example of some data you would want to protect from having people access it without authorization. People's personal information, like their phone numbers, address, social security number, spouse's names, things like that. Other confidential information, you wouldn't want everybody in your organization looking at your financial information, your revenues, and things like that. So that's something else that you might want to keep under wraps. Of course, there are lots of other things where data is a very relevant topic. So I'll show you a couple of techniques for keeping that data a little bit safer and restricting access to it. So the first technique, which we've been using for a while, is to use passwords to encrypt some of your data. This is a feature we provide with our qRules tool. It has a command called encrypt and another called decrypt, which will basically, as the name says, it will encrypt some data using a password that the user has entered, and later on you can decrypt that same data using the same password and get back the original stuff that you had. We have an XTP that demonstrates this technique. It's called the QdEncryption XTP, and I believe that's available on our website, but if it's not, it will be included in today's package. So the QdEncryption XTP is more intended as a demo of the encryption techniques than an actual XTP. The encryption technique is fairly simple. But to use the XTP, you would inject qRules into your form, add the XTP to your InfoPath custom controls, if it's not there already. Add the control to your form, delete any parts you don't need, and then there's some adjusting of XPaths and commands. There are some places where it's setting the commands to its own data sources. You'll need to redirect those so they're setting the command field in the actual Qdabra rules data source. This is what it looks like. We've got, so there's a field here for the password, one for the text. This will encrypt and decrypt some text. You can encrypt and decrypt images. Of course, the images won't be visible while they're encrypted. That's the whole point. And the same goes for files. So let's switch over to a quick demo of this technique. So here I have a simple form with 2 copies of the XTP in it. I've renamed some of the fields and modified the commands accordingly. Here we have a button. There's some logic here to make sure everything's consistent. Here's basically what the command looks like. We've got the XPath of the field to encrypt. We've got the XPath of the place where the password is going to be entered. And this pad equals yes adds some text at the beginning of the encrypted text so that you can recognize it as encrypted data and handle that accordingly. So as you can see here, if the field begins with QdEncrypt, pad adds QdEncrypt to the beginning of the field value, then it will hide this control so it doesn't show a non-working control, and it will show this text to indicate that the control contains an encrypted value. And the same goes here. So let's give this a preview. I'll use the password hello here, and I'll just attach this XSN, and now it's encrypted. So I can try to enter a different password and decrypt it, but that's not going to work. I enter the right password, and then I get my data back. Do the same thing just as well with field values. I entered a value here, and it's displaying down here. But when I enter a password and encrypt it, now it's encrypted. Nobody can tell what the original field value was. Enter it again, decrypt, and I get back my original message. Now, some of you might be wondering about the safety of having this the password displayed right in the form, and you're certainly right. So, techniques that we will often use for protecting that is we'll either use a garbled font like webdings or wingdings, so that people can't really tell what you're typing, or you can set the font color to the same color as the background so you can't see what they're typing there either. The first one has a slight benefit that you can see how many characters you've entered, but the slight disadvantage that if somebody were really good at recognizing wingdings, they could probably figure out what you're typing. Of course, the encrypt and decrypt commands reset this password field so that it doesn't contain a value after an encryption and decryption. You wouldn't want that stored in the form. And so the idea here is that you would encrypt the value, submit the form, and then later pull it up and want to decrypt it again. So that's how our encryption works. Of course, one thing you'll notice there is that in order to use this method for protecting your data, you're going to have to know what the password is when you encrypt it, and know the same password when you decrypt it. So that's fine when you want to store something that's your own data that you want to get back later. You want to store it somewhere, but you don't want anybody else to see it. That's a fine way to go. But what if you want to have other people submit data to you and not have it accessible to everybody so they can just go in and see it? Well, in that case, using passwords wouldn't be such a great idea, because they would have to send you your password, send you the password that they used when they encrypted their stuff. You'd have to keep track of all those passwords, and with all those passwords flying around in email, that's not such a safe concept. So another concept we came up with is saving data outside your form. So the idea here is that you have a parent form that stores most of the field values for whatever is being submitted. And then you have a child form that's used for storing the more sensitive data that's part of the form. So when someone enters their data, it doesn't actually get stored in the main data source, but it's stored in a secondary data source. And when they submit their data, the secondary data source goes off to one DBXL doctype, and the main data source goes to the main DBXL doctype, and so the data is in two places. You can restrict access to the child doctype and make the parent doctype a little more accessible so that people can open it and modify values in it when they need to. To get the data back, you can use DBXL's query documents node set, which is a web method that allows you to query data directly from the XML of documents stored in DBXL. And the nice thing about this is that it will enforce permissions. It will enforce document type level permissions across the whole doctype, or it can enforce document level permissions for individual documents. So you can really customize that and control who has access to which stuff. So I'll go into this in a little more detail after a few more slides. But the concept here is that, say somebody is applying to participate in a program. We have the mentors, their personal information, social security number, phone number, name, address, city, state, zip, and then there's one other field for about the program itself, the reason for applying. So it's fine to store this in some place this reason for applying to some place that's accessible to everybody, but we probably don't want everyone having access to these values. So we can save these out to some place that's only accessible to a few people, and then it will be safer. So to start off, you create a child doctype, and you want to use a simple and flat data source, just a few fields. You're going to be requerying this back using a query documents node set, so you want it pretty simple. And don't use too many fields. Make it easier. We'll associate the child documents to their parent document using a GUID. We use qRules to generate the GUID, and that will go here in this parent form field. And since query documents node set requires some data in order to set up a data connection to it, you'll need some sample data to query off the bat. So I would suggest adding a button to submit a few empty documents to the doctype, just so the XML is there and you can query it. It'll lay out the simple controls for verifying your contents. So that's what I've done here. Got a simple data source, some fields just so I can check what's there. Since Social Security is a bit higher in the sensitivity, I haven't included that here. And then there's a button here. It's hidden if there's basically if the parent form field is not blank. So I can open this up, click that a couple times, and that'll create some empty documents that I can use to set up my data source to query it. So one thing you can do in order to use this feature in a lot of parent doctypes, if you're going to be collecting applicant data or user data in a lot of different forms, what you can do is create an XTP for submitting the child data, add the necessary data connections, add your logic, and the controls. And then people can just drop the XTP into their form, do a little bit of modification, and they're ready to go. And what I say here, one bound to the template XML data source, and one bound to the query data source. So let's take a quick look at this XTP. So what I've done here is I extracted the source for the person information template, and I've added it as a data connection right here. So as you can see, the main data source of this XTP just has the root node, but the actual data is stored here in a secondary data source. So the idea is that they would fill this out, they trigger some submit logic which would submit this off to DBXL. Keep that logic here in a secondary data source. It's just using a qRules submit to DBXL command. Then I have another data connection here to query the data back from DBXL. So here in my logic data source, I have GUID. So when I set this GUID to the parent form's ID, it will perform the query back the data, and then that queried data will be stored down here. And when I've set the ID, I don't want to display both of these, so then the top one will be hidden. And then you also want to account for the situation where the person opening the form doesn't have access to this higher security stuff. So this will be displayed if the query has been performed, but they didn't have access to it. So there's the XTP. So to actually add this XTP to your form, again, like with the QdEncryption, you would add it as a custom control, drop it in, and there will be some logic you would have to adjust. You'll need to add logic to generate a GUID, which will store the GUID in both the parent form and assign it into the logic fields for it, or the data fields for the XTP, so you have that link between the parent form and the child form. You'll have the submit logic to submit the secondary data source. That's already in the XTP, but it's since the XTP doesn't have qRules in it, you'll need to redirect that from the field it's assigned to the actual Qdabra rules field, just like in the QdEncryption. And then some logic to requery the child data when the form is reopened, and ensure that subsequent submits don't resubmit the child data. So, back to this. We can see that on form load, if there is already a GUID in the form, we query the child data. We assign it to this person GUID field in the XTP's logic data source. If there's no GUID, then we just use qRules to generate one and assign it to both places. So this one assigns into the main data source's form GUID field, and then the form GUID field has logic to copy it over into the XTP's field. And when we submit, first we trigger the logic in the XTP. We've set up some logic in the XTP that'll just go off and do its thing when we set it, trigger it with a value. And then we do the actual submit. And this is again using qRules. Submit the main data source to DBXL. I know this is pretty abstract and a bit nebulous, so I think if you download these sample files and tinker around with them a little bit, you'll start to get the idea. But let's just have a quick demo right now. So here is our program participation data, Doctype. So you can see we have two Doctypes, one for the parent forms and one for the child forms. And the idea is that you would go into this child form and set up the permissions so that only certain people can access it, or set up the document level permissions so that they are dependent on the content of the form. So here's the form in action. So I fill in the user data, enter a field value here, and then submit. So if I go into the documents here, what I'll find is that I have a submitted document. But if I download it, open it up in a text editor, and the only fields it contains is this, the GUID field, first name and last name, which I store just so it's easily accessible. We probably don't need to put that much security on just the names themselves. And then the reason for applying, which is not a protected field. Then we go over to the child Doctype, and we can see that all those values are stored in here. And of course, if I were someone who didn't have permission to access and read from this Doctype, then I wouldn't be able to open this up. And just to show you that we can round trip this whole thing, I open up this form, the parent form, queries the data, and there it is, in a read-only format. And as I said, if I didn't have permission to this data, then I would not be able to display it here. So that's it for the presentation and demo. I'd like to remind you that the InfoPath Dev Forum is always available for your InfoPath questions. Just come over and ask us anything you want. It's completely free. And we also offer some training, and we have some coming up. And I believe Marcy will talk a bit about that.
Yes, we've got an in-person master training class coming up in May. That's going to be in Kirkland, Washington. We do still have a few spots left for that. And then we also have a newer program, which is our Quick Start program, which is an online course, only 30 minutes per day for 5 days. And that one's coming up in April. So if you want more information, you can either email the course manager at qdabra.com or go to our website under the training tab.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marcy. So now we're going to open up the room for questions, and it looks like we've already got a couple coming in, so let's see. How strong is the QdEncryption set for? That I do not know the specifics of the encryption, but I can certainly get you an answer on that, so please send us that question via email. It looks like Carl had the same question, so same thing. Please ask us via email, and we'll try to include a little note about that in the webinar package. Is form with encrypted content portable to another environment? Um, I believe the answer to this is that the password specified in the form when encrypting the data is what's used as the hash. So I would say, oh, I would have to check on this, but I would say that taking that field value and moving it to another form would still allow you to decrypt it with the same password. It shouldn't be dependent on the file itself. The second technique, I would say, I'm not entirely sure how much SharePoint's permissions will allow you to do. Of course, with this technique, you'll need to allow the submitter's permission to submit to the library or Doctype, and then you would need to restrict read permissions to only a small group of people. So, if that is possible in SharePoint, and I would have to check on that, then I would say you could use SharePoint. I think SharePoint doesn't give you quite as much flexibility with permissions. That's one of the reasons we made QdEncryption. So there's a possibility that it wouldn't be possible. Submitting the form to an SQL database. You would not want to, I assume you're asking about the second technique? Would that be correct? Yes. You would probably not want to submit the protected data to an SQL database. One reason is that anybody who has access to that database would just be able to see all of the protected data. QueryDB, which is our web service for querying data from a database, does not enforce table level or row level permissions. So that would just be wide open if the protected data were submitted to the database. Of course, if you want to submit the data from the, well, the issue there would be that, of course, yes, if you want to just push the data into the database and not query it back into the form, then you would be able to do that as long as you don't make the database accessible through QueryDB. And yeah, that should be fine. Does that answer your question? Great. Well, thank you very much, Nathan. I'm glad it was useful to you.